This dam was never supposed to look like this. It was designed to bring power and prosperity to this valley. Instead, it collapsed, and everything below it paid the price. The failure wasn't sudden, and it wasn't inevitable. This is the story of the Gleno Dam, a project that promised progress but delivered one of Italy's costliest engineering disasters. This is the Scalve Valley, just northwest of Lake Iseo in central Lombardy, hidden among what are known as the Pre-Alps, or the Alpine foothills. The valley was carved out by the Dezzo River around 3 million years ago, and that river still runs through it to this day, its strong, steady flow facilitated by multiple alpine streams which empty into it. And one of those is the Gleno stream, which flows from the summit of Mount Gleno up here at the top of the valley and joins the river Dezzo in the town of Vilminore di Scalve. This region of Italy and the adjacent regions to the east and west are basically a sort of hydroelectric engineering playground full of mountains and cliff faces with millions of bodies of flowing water. And as Italy rapidly industrialized in the 1910s and 20s, the country, in order to meet the excess power demand that was being created by those factories and that manufacturing industry, went absolutely damn crazy. The government began working with engineers and other industry leaders to coordinate a mass build-out of dams in the Alps and their foothills. One of the engineers commissioned by the government was Giuseppe Gumur, who in 1907 envisioned that damming the Gleno stream at the Piana del Gleno, here, would create a steady, reliable source of power for the region, and he began drawing up plans to create a large-scale gravity dam. Due to the lengthy process of creating designs, undertaking feasibility studies, and attempting to get the right permits, the initial planning of the Gleno Dam took almost 9 years and was not helped by the outbreak of World War I, which basically saw the Italian government temporarily abandon most major engineering and public works projects. But in 1916, Gumur was approached by two brothers, Michelangelo and Virgilio Vigano, owners of the Galeazzo Vigano textile factory in Triuggio, just outside Milan. The factory, named for Michelangelo and Virgilio's father, was one of many that found itself paying ever-increasing prices for power as demand outstripped supply, and electricity contracts routinely expired and then were renewed at much higher costs. So they bought Gumur's idea for a gravity dam and launched the temporary Vigano Construction Company, which was to fund and construct the project. And the brothers kept Gumur on to oversee the site as a project manager. And later that same year, in 1916, construction began on the Gleno Dam, with huge mounds of earth being moved in order to facilitate the project. Now, you might have noticed a bit of a problem here, and that's that at no point have I stated that any government authorities had actually greenlit the project by this point. So by the time the government did eventually give the all clear in 1917, construction had already started, illegally. Gumur, a trained engineer who was well respected in northern Italy, knew that the best design for this terrain and this body of water was a gravity dam. A gravity dam is a gigantic construction of concrete that is roughly triangular in shape if viewed in a cross-section. It works by simply being too heavy to move. It's anchored into the earth around it and is much thicker at the bottom than the top. These designs are great for particularly large or wide valleys with very stable rock foundations. The one problem with them is that due to their sheer size, they are one of the more costly types of dam design, but we'll return to that later. Let's head back to Gleno. With construction underway, things were looking good. But despite having no training in engineering, Michelangelo Vigano was notoriously hands-on, and his relationship with Gumur, who was a literal engineer, began to sour as Vigano kept interfering with Gumur's design and imparting his own opinions on how it should be built. And so in 1917, Gumur resigned as project manager due to his differences with Vigano, and was replaced by Gino Consigli, who also resigned literally a couple months later, writing a letter to Gumur in which he called Michelangelo incompetent and unbalanced, asking, "Is it possible that I have no defense against the madness of such an idiot?" Michelangelo Vigano suddenly died in 1918, and operations were overtaken by his brother Virgilio Vigano, who appointed engineer Francesco Sant'Angelo as project lead. But despite Virgilio having at least minor experience with power plants in his past, this moment is where the train began to derail. Now, what happened next is the source of some debate. In the second half of 1920, a postcard arrived at the civil engineer's office in Bergamo, which is just south of here, and it was postmarked from the village of Dezzo, which is just below this dam in the valley. And it contained an anonymous tip-off that large amounts of lime mortar were being used in the construction of the gravity dam wall, rather than the cement that should have been used for a gravity dam of this size. Now, lime mortar is a traditional building material made from limestone. It's been used for centuries in ordinary masonry, and it's perfectly fine for that, but it's much weaker than a purer cement-based concrete. According to an extremely thorough online write-up of the history of the Gleno Dam by Sergio Pifari, the original contract between Gamur and the Vigano company stipulated that lime was permitted to be used together with cement in the construction of the wall. But the anonymous postcard from Dezzo alleged that lime was being used instead of cement, which is a whole other accusation. The truth is that lime, in general, is much cheaper and faster setting than cement, and in a frugal post-war country where raw materials were scarce and expensive, I guess it was the easier option. Furthermore, the specifications of the contract said that the rocks and gravel used in construction needed to be power washed in order to smooth their surfaces and avoid leaving gaps, something that was very much not done. I couldn't find a reason for this. It appears to have just been negligence. Also, workers at the site started complaining that any old rubbish was being thrown into the dam wall to aid in its construction, from tar to bits of old iron that had been left over from the First World War, and these are things that concrete cannot adequately stick to. The materials issue may have played a part in the eventual fate of the Gleno Dam, but in the grand scheme of things, its impact was minimal compared to what happened next. In 1920, rumours began to circulate that the relevant authorities were about to crack down on the construction of gravity dams and more heavily regulate them in order to mitigate the slightly sort of lawless atmosphere within the construction sector at the time. And Sant'Angelo and Vigano believed that their gravity design, their half-completed one, would have to be scrapped. And so Sant'Angelo suggested preemptively changing the design halfway through construction to what is called a multiple arch dam. A multiple arch dam is basically a series of curved arches with buttresses designed to divide the water pressure into smaller, more manageable components, which is economically advantageous for certain sites where a massive gravity dam might be too expensive or impractical. They are much thinner than gravity dams and thus require far less raw material to build, and thus are generally much cheaper. Now, a multiple arch dam is a perfectly reasonable dam design and has been used all over the world for centuries. But Gamur had chosen a gravity dam design because it was by far the most appropriate for Gleno's landscape and rock type. So choosing a multiple arch design would have been a risky decision even if they had started the project with that design in mind. What was absolutely unfathomable about the Gleno Dam is that the designs were changed by Sant'Angelo halfway through construction. The foundations for a gravity dam had already been built, and they just thought that they could plop a multiple arch dam on top of it, claiming it was some form of innovative hybrid design. What's more, Vigano dismissed the construction company that had completed the work up until now and brought in an entirely new firm, Vita Construction, to begin the multiple arch portion of the dam, who were not adequately briefed on the construction so far, and also complained that said work up until this point had been shoddy. Vigano submitted an application to the relevant authorities to change the design, but once again, did not wait for a reply, instead beginning work on this Frankenstein's monster of a dam without the required permits. Construction on the dam continued, albeit very slowly, and in late 1921, the Civil Engineering Department granted Vigano a permit to change the design from a gravity dam to a multiple arch dam, which obviously the guys up here had already started doing without their permission, so that's lucky, innit? Weirdly, an accident report later showed that Civil Engineering Department inspectors visited the site frequently during all 5 years of its construction, meaning that they would have seen that construction had started without their permission, and also surely they would have spotted that the hybrid dam design wouldn't work. So, corruption? Negligence? Both? The autumn and winter of 1921 to 1922 was quite a rainy one in the Scalve Valley, and with the dam partly in place, the reservoir it had created began to fill to a height of around 12 meters. According to the dam's warden, leaks were immediately noticed all over the structure, with water trickling through the dam's inadvertently porous design. And yet again, nothing was done. And this is despite the fact that workers on the dam at the time expressed their concerns over how the dam was being built. Quotes from construction workers on the dam include, "Out of fear of being fired, I had to rush the construction work, which was consequently poorly done and had no guarantee of stability." Another said, "I saw that the masonry wasn't done properly. Rocks and mortar were thrown haphazardly into the piers." And the most telling one said, "The system needs to be changed. Otherwise, in the future, we may pay dearly for what is being done today." Rainfall was particularly severe across northern Italy in the early weeks of October 1923, and the 22nd of that month saw the reservoir filled for the first time. Once again, leaks were immediately spotted. But contrary to what you might think, that wasn't actually the dam's biggest problem. The spillways were. The dam had been mostly constructed from lime mortar, sometimes with just minor traces of cement, and, quote, This lime masonry was laid with no care, without adequate preparation of the rock base, and without sufficient cohesion between the blocks. This meant it was quite vulnerable to erosion under heavy water flows. With the extremely heavy rain that fell over the autumn of 1923, the dam was perennially overflowing and the spillways were in near constant use. Due to its poor design, the spillways were directing water directly onto the lower portions of the dam wall, particularly onto the bases of the arches which made up the multiple arch dam design, for weeks and weeks at a time. Hit particularly hard was the base of the central pylon of the dam, here. With rumours of leaks and a botched construction process spreading through the villages in the valley below, a number of residents confronted Bergamo directly, suggesting that they were concerned that the dam might break. In response, Bergamo told them that he was planning to build his own house directly underneath the dam in order to prove its safety. However, dozens of residents were not convinced, and many of them fled the villages below for fear that a catastrophe was imminent. On the 29th of November, after a month of spillway flow, engineer Conti and Vigano made a peculiar call that no inquest or investigation ever managed to get to the bottom of. The dam was built with an enormous outlet valve at its base, designed to stop overflowing and allow water to spill out below and away from the structure. Dam guardian Morzenti, still concerned about the endless flowing water, asked Conti and Vigano if he could open it to relieve pressure on the spillways. They declined his request, and instead, Conti ordered engineering assistant Giudice Sperandio to board up the tops of the spillways with wooden planks to mitigate the flow of the water. This was done, and it slowed but didn't stop the flow of water, meaning the erosion continued, only at a smaller scale. More problematic, however, was that with the continued heavy rainfall and the slow flow of water, now much slower flow of water out of the spillways, the level of the reservoir continued to rise, and eventually it exceeded the dam's original capacity, which exerted a huge amount of weight and pressure on the dam. Now, this would have been a problem for any dam that had been constructed as shoddily as this one, but considering that this one had also been weakened by weeks of erosion due to its poorly designed spillways, disaster was all but inevitable. On the 1st of December 1923, at 7:15 a.m., the central pylon of the dam, which had been weathered away and weakened by a month's worth of flowing water, gave way. This breach spread across the structure, washing away arches one by one until an 80-metre chasm had opened up across the face of the dam. Within just 12 minutes, the entire contents of the reservoir, 6 million cubic metres of water, emptied into the Scalve Valley below. As it thundered through the valley, it displaced the air in front of it, creating a violent blast that ripped clothing off people and knocked several structures down. Then the water arrived. First hit was the village of Bergamo, directly below the dam, which was almost entirely destroyed. 15 minutes later, it reached Dezzo, mostly obliterating it, before almost half an hour later it raged its way through Mazzuno and Corna di Darfo, causing massive amounts of damage and washing dozens of buildings away. The wall of water and mud eventually flowed southwest down the Camonica Valley and emptied into Lake Iseo at 8 a.m., nearly 50 kilometers from the dam. The destruction was devastating. Houses, businesses, and possessions were washed away in the wall of mud and water, with hundreds left homeless and destitute as the waves swept through. When the dust settled and rescue operations were complete, the official death toll given by the Italian government was 356. However, around 250 people were listed as missing and never found, meaning the death toll could be as high as around 600, though this figure is disputed. The town of Dezzo was hit the hardest, with at least 200 deaths alone recorded in the small village from a population of around 1,500 people. According to Sergio Pifari, around 30% of the total victims of the disaster were children, with two, one in Dezzo and one in Corna di Darfo, listed only by their surnames as they were only a handful of hours old and had not yet been baptized with given names. Once the communities affected could get back on their feet and start the process of rebuilding, only one question remained. Who was to blame for this catastrophe? It's easy to point the finger at Vigano. After all, this dam was his baby. He was ultimately in charge of its construction and the buck stopped with him. But what about Sant'Angelo? His unprecedented and dangerous decision to switch the dam's design halfway through construction was probably the most obvious cause of the disaster. But what about the construction leaders who switched out concrete for cheaper building materials and allowed a bunch of random scrap metal to be used in the dam wall? Would Sant'Angelo's design still have failed if it were built with the required concrete-lime mix? And what about the regulators and investigators who repeatedly failed to adequately audit the site and were far too lax with their permits? The chain of culpability was long, and the people of Italy wanted answers. Legal proceedings began in earnest almost immediately. On the 30th of December 1923, the public prosecutor indicted Virgilio, Giuseppina, Paolo, Carlo, Giulio, Antonio, Franca and Carmelita Vigano, all members of the Vigano family and all involved in the dam's construction. Engineer Sant'Angelo was predictably also indicted, as was Luigi Vita, the owner of Vita Construction. According to Sergio Pifari, the official charge was for having built an artificial reservoir and dam, proceeding with its construction with negligence and inexperience, and having failed to carry out appropriate soil tests prior to the construction itself. The trial began in 1925, with a verdict issued in 1927. Virgilio Vigano and Sant'Angelo were both found guilty and sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in prison for involuntary manslaughter. Both were fined 7,500 lira, or around 15,000 euros in today's money. The sentence was seen as lax by those affected by the disaster, especially as all 8 remaining defendants were acquitted. The following year, in 1928, Vigano, who had begun an appeals process as he was convinced that he was being made a scapegoat by more powerful regulatory forces in the region, died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage. He was 46 years old. However, it got worse. In 1928, Sant'Angelo's conviction was overturned due to a lack of evidence. And that means that after 5 years of pain, the people of the Scalve Valley were forced to accept that ultimately nobody would be held responsible for the destruction of their communities, their livelihoods, and their families. The song you're currently hearing is a folk tune written by Andrea Pollini to commemorate the disaster and sung in the Bergamasque dialect of the Lombard language, local to the Scalve Valley. The lyrics speak for themselves.
I segekrit höll sa jornal, I fai poeti töl perol kul, I fai hafare, I fale magagne, dopo la culpole delle montagne.
The people of the Scalve Valley were awarded 2 batches of 6 million lira, one from the government and one from the Vigano company, totaling around 12 million lira or about 4 million euros in today's money. No care was allegedly made to appropriately distribute this money, and so many were left with nothing. Still, the towns in the wave's path were eventually rebuilt, even Bueggio, almost completely obliterated by the disaster. Life has returned to these villages, but always in the shadow of a megastructure that promised prosperity and instead delivered destruction on a scale this valley had never expected to bear witness to. The ruins of the Gleno Dam remain, looming over the valley. Locals rarely visit them or give them much thought, yet they are not forgotten. Instead, the disaster has settled into what sociologist Lorenzo Migliorati calls a cultural trauma, woven into the collective identity of the communities that it scarred. Migliorati interviewed residents a century on from the disaster and asked them what they believed the cause was, giving them options ranging from an act of God to sabotage and back again. And 60% of the people who responded chose the option, if someone had not wanted to make money at any cost, this would not have happened. In this way, the trial's lack of accountability has become less an open wound than a shared resignation, the understanding that ordinary people are usually the first and most numerous victims when profit is put above safety. Justice is no longer sought for the Gleno Dam disaster. Those responsible are long gone. What remains is remembrance, commemoration, and stories passed down, not to relitigate blame but to keep the memory alive. As Migliorati puts it, the Gleno disaster is configured 100 years later as a routinized and memorized trauma in the collective consciousness. The ruins speak for themselves. Stories are told, testimonies remain. What happened is clear, the historical event is closed, the responsibilities identified. It could be said that the most diffused feeling about the Gleno disaster is that it is an event that happened about which everything has now been said.